Okay, let's dive into a powerful and honestly a very difficult story from the Soviet past. We're going to talk about the Holodomor, the great famine that tore through Ukraine in the early 1930s. But this is so much more than a story about hunger. It's a story of how a landscape, a people, and a memory were systematically taken apart and then fiercely reclaimed.
To really get what happened, we first have to understand what was lost. So let's start by just listening. Listening to the world that used to be, the vibrant, living countryside of Ukraine right before the famine hit.
I mean, this quote just pulls you right in, doesn't it? It gives you a sense of that lost soundscape. This was a world that ran on natural rhythms, the changing of the seasons, the sounds of work, and the really deep roots of community.
But then, Soviet policy arrived, and it completely changed the environment. Those familiar, organic sounds of village life, the church bells, the leaves on the trees, they were just gone, replaced by the noise of the state, the roar of a tractor, the sound of trees being cut down, and then, eventually, just silence. A profound and really unnerving silence.
So you have to ask, right? What was behind all this? It's crucial to understand that this wasn't an accident. This was a plan. It was a massive, top-down project to completely remake a nation, no matter the human cost.
And at the very heart of that plan was this one word, collectivization. The idea was, in a way, simple and brutal. Take control of all agriculture away from millions of individual peasants, force them onto giant state-run farms, and use the profits to fuel a huge leap into industrialization.
And Stalin himself, he didn't really try to hide it. He framed it as a harsh necessity. He argued that the peasantry had to pay a tribute, basically an extra tax, to build this powerful, modern socialist state. It was a sacrifice he was more than willing to force on them. And the process was just so methodical. It was like a three-step attack designed to shatter the traditional way of life in the village. First, take the land. Second, force the people onto collective farms. And third, eliminate anyone who got in the way by branding them an enemy of the state.
But that brings up a huge question. Who exactly was this enemy? Who was a kulak? The state had defined this entire class of people to be destroyed, but the definition itself was, well, let's just say it was dangerously slippery. In reality, the label kulak was a political weapon. It was supposed to mean a rich farmer, but in practice, you could be branded a kulak for owning just 2 cows. You could be a poor peasant who just spoke out against the policy, and boom, you're a kulak. It was a terrifyingly flexible label, and it was designed to crush any and all opposition.
Now, you can probably guess what happened next. The peasants didn't just accept this, they fought back. There were thousands of protests and riots all across Ukraine. But as that resistance grew, the state's response escalated into something truly catastrophic. Just look at this timeline. Between 1932 and 1933, a series of decrees systematically weaponized food. First, an impossibly high grain quota was forced on Ukraine. Then came the infamous law of 5 years of corn, which meant that taking even a handful of leftover grain from a field was a crime punishable by death. And then the final brutal act. The borders of Ukraine were sealed, trapping millions inside to starve.
And this is where that very specific name comes from, Holodomor. It's a Ukrainian term that means execution by starvation. The name itself tells you everything you need to know about how this event is understood. Not as a natural disaster, but as a deliberate act.
The numbers are just staggering. Even as the famine was tightening its grip, the state managed to pull nearly 23 million tons of grain from the harvest. You had these special activist brigades going house to house, using these long metal rods to probe the ground, the walls, anywhere food might be hidden, and they took everything.
And the stories from survivors are just gut-wrenching. People ate grass, weeds, tree bark, leather, anything. This quote from a survivor named Maria about her mother making little breads from sawdust and chaff, I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine. And through all of this, the state offered zero relief.
The aftermath was a land of ghosts. The death toll was so catastrophic that it created a demographic collapse. And it also led to an immediate, systematic cover-up by
by the Soviet regime.
The number of victims across the entire Soviet Union was at least 5 million, but modern historians, using new data, estimate that in Ukraine alone, the death toll was at least 3.9 million people. It's a demographic black hole.
And what was the state's response to all these empty villages? It wasn't aid. It was repopulation. They moved more than 100,000 people from Russia and Belarus into the homes of the dead. It was a deliberate attempt to literally erase what had just happened.
And this right here just shows you the sheer insanity of the cover-up. When the official 1937 census came out, the numbers clearly showed the horrifying population loss. So what did Stalin's regime do? They didn't publish the data. They declared the census itself a failure, suppressed the results, and had the statisticians who ran it arrested and shot.
Okay, so this brings us to the central historical debate, one that has really heated up since the Soviet archives were opened. Was the famine in Ukraine a tragic but unintended consequence of a brutal policy, or was it something more targeted, an intentional act of genocide?
You really have two main arguments here. Those who argue it was genocide point to policies that seem to single out Ukraine, like sealing the borders and the fact that it happened alongside a fierce campaign against Ukrainian culture. Others argue that it was a horrific but unintended result of a fanatical Soviet policy. They point out that things like drought and pests made the harvest much worse, and that other Soviet regions also saw millions die from famine.
But the story doesn't just end there, with the famine and the cover-up. The struggle over its memory, over the very truth of what happened, has continued for decades, right into our present day.
I mean, think about it. For more than half a century, it was a crime to even mention the famine in the Soviet Union. It was a state secret. The silence was first broken not in Ukraine, but by Ukrainian communities in the West. It wasn't until 2006 that the parliament of a free, independent Ukraine could finally officially recognize the Holodomor as an act of genocide.
And that leaves us with this huge, final question, one that echoes far beyond the 1930s. How does a nation ever heal from a wound that it was forbidden to even talk about? It's a question that reminds us that the fight over history is, and always will be, a fight for the future.